Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 5. The author permitted to see the Grand Academy of Lagado, the academy largely described, the arts wherein the professors employ themselves. This academy is not an entire singular building, but a continuation of several houses on both sides of a street, which growing vast was purchased and applied to that use. I was received very kindly by the warden, and went for many days to the academy. Every room hath in one or more projectors, and I believe I cannot be in fewer than 500 rooms. The first man I saw was a meagre aspect, with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged, and singed in several places. His clothes, shirt, and skin were all of the same color. He had been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers, which were to be put into vials hermetically sealed, and let out to warm in the air in the raw inclement summers. He told me he did not doubt in 8 years more he should be able to supply the governor's garden with sunshine at a reasonable rate. But he complained that his stock was low, and he entreated me to give him something as an encouragement to ingenuity, especially since this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. I made him a small present, for my lord had furnished me with money on purpose, because he knew their practice of begging from all who go to see them. I went to another chamber, but this one was ready to hasten back, because almost overcome with a horrible stink. My conductor pressed me forward, conjuring me in a whisper to give no offence, which would be highly resent, and therefore I durst not so much as my nose. The projector of this cell was the most ancient student of the academy. His face and beard were of pale yellow, his hands and clothes daubed all over with filth. When I was presented to him, he gave me a very close embrace, a compliment I could well have excused. His employment for his coming in the academy was an operation to reduce human excrement to its original food, by separating the several parts, removing the tincture which receives from the gall, and makes the odor exhale, and the scummings of the saliva. He had a weekly allowance from the society of a vessel filled with human ordure, about the bigness of a Bristol barrel. I saw another at work with counselling ice into gunpowder, who likewise shewed me a treatise that he had written concerning the malleability of fire, which he intended to publish. There was the most ingenious architect who contrived a new method for building houses, by the beginning at the roof, working downwards for the foundation, which justified to see me by the practice of those prudent insects, the bee and the spider. There was a man born blind, who had several apprentices in his own condition. Their employment was to mix colours for painters, which their master taught them to distinguish by feeling and smelling. It was indeed my misfortune to find them, at the time, not very perfect in their lessons, and the professor himself happened to be generally mistaken. This artist is much encouraged and esteemed by the whole fraternity. In another apartment I was highly pleased with a projector, who had found a device of ploughing the ground with hogs, to save the charges of ploughs, cattle, and labour. The method is this. In an acre of ground you bury at 6 inches distant and 8 deep a quantity of acorns, dates, chestnuts, and other mates or vegetables whereof these animals are the fondest. Then you drive 600 or more of them into the field, where in a few days they will root up the ground in search of their food, and make it fit for sowing, at the same time manuring it with their dung. It is true upon the experiment that they found the charge and trouble very great, and they had little or no crop. However, it is not doubted that this invention may be capable of the greatest improvement. I went into another room, where the walls and ceilings were all hung round with cobwebs, except a narrow passage for the artist to go in and out. At my entrance he called me aloud to me not to disturb his webs. He lamented a fatal mistake the world had been so long in using silkworms, while we had plenty of domestic insects, who infinitely excelled the former, because they understood how to weave as well as spin. And he proposed farther that employing spiders in the charge of dyeing silks should be wholly saved. Whereof I was fully convinced that he shewed me a vast number of flies most beautifully coloured, whereof he fed them, and as they've been all a whose, he hoped to fit everybody's fancy, as soon as he could find a proper food for the flies of certain gums, oils, and other glutinous matter to give a strength inconsistent to the threads. There was an astronomer who had undertaken to place sundial under the great weathercock on the town-house, by adjusting an annual and diurnal motions of the earth and sun, so as to answer to coincide with all the accidental turnings by the wind. I was complaining of the small fit of the cholic, upon which my conductor led me into a room, where a great physician resided, who was famous for curing that disease by contrary of operations from the same instrument. He had a large pair of bellows, with a long slender muzzle of ivory. He conveyed 8 inches up the angus, and drawing in the wind, he affirmed he could make the guts in length as dried bladder. But when the disease was more stubborn and violent, he let in the muzzle while the bellows were full of wind, and discharged into the body of the patient, then withdrew the instrument to replenish it, clapping his thumb strongly against the orifice of the fundament, and at this, repeated 3 or 4 times, the adventitious wind would rush out, bringing a noxious along with it, like water being put into a pump. And the patient recovered. I saw him try both experiments upon a dog, but could not discern any effect for the former, as the latter, but the animal was ready to burst, made so violent a discharge as was very offensive to me and my companions. The dog died on the spot, and we left the doctor endeavouring to recover him by the same operation. I visited many other apartments, but I shall not trouble my reader with all the curiosity I observed, being studious of brevity. I had hitherto seen only one side of the academy, and the other being appropriate to the advancers of the speculative learning, of whom I shall say something when I have mentioned one illustrious person more, who is called among them the universal artist. He told us he had been 30 years employing his thoughts for the improvement of human life. He had 2 large rooms, full of wonder and curiosities. The 50 men at work, some were condensing air into dry tangible substance, by the extracting the nitre, and letting all the aqueous or fluid particles percolate, and others softening marble for pillows and pincushions, others petrifying the hoofs of a living horse to preserve them from foundering. The artist himself was at the time busy upon 2 great designs. The first to sow a land with a shaft, wherein he affirmed had the true sentimental virtue to be contained, as he demonstrated by several experiments, which I was not skilful enough to comprehend. The other was, by a certain composition of gums, minerals, and vegetables outwardly applied to prevent the growth of wool upon young lambs. He hoped in a reasonable time to propagate the breed of naked sheep all over the kingdom. We crossed a walk to the other part of the academy, where, as I've already said, the projectors of speculative learning resided. The first professor I saw was in a very large room, 40 pupils about him. After salutations, observing me to look earnestly upon a frame, and took up the greatest part at both length and breadth of the room. He said, perhaps I might wonder to see him employ a project for improving speculative knowledge by the practical and mechanical operations. But the world would soon be sensible of its usefulness, and he flattered himself that a more notable exalted thought never sprung in any other man's head. Everyone knew how laborious the usual method is of attaining to arts and sciences, whereas by his contrivances the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge, and with a little bodily labour, may write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology, without the least assistance from a genius or study. He then led me to the frame, about the size of whereof all his pupils stood in rank. It was 20 foot square. Placed in the middle of the room, the superficies were composed of several bits of wood, about the bigness of a die, some larger than others. They were all linked together by slender wires. These bits of wood were covered every square with papers pasted on them, and on these papers were written all the words of their language in several moods, tenses, and declensions, but without any order. The professor desired me to observe, for he was going to set his engine at work. The pupils, at his command, took out each of them holding an iron handle, whereof there were 40 fixed around the edges of the frame, giving them a sudden turn. A whole disposition of the words were entirely changed. He then commanded 36 of the lads to read the several lines softly as they appeared upon the frame, where they found 3 or 4 words together might make the part of a sentence. They dictated to the 4 remaining boys who were scribes. This work was repeated 3 or 4 times. Every time the engine was so contrived that the words shifted into new places, as the square bits of wood moved upside down. 6 hours a day the young students were employed into this labor, and the professor shewed me several volumes in large folios already collected, or broken sentences he intended to piece together, and out of the rich material to give the world a complete body of all arts and sciences, which, however, might still be improved. Much expended in the public would raise a fund and make oblige of the manors to contribute in the common several collections. He assured me that this invention had employed all of his thoughts from his youth, that he had emptied the whole vocabulary into his frame, and made the strictest computations of the general population there in the books, between the number of particles, nouns, and verbs in other parts of speech. I made my humblest acknowledgment unto this illustrious person for a great communicativeness, and promised, if ever I had the good fortune to return to my native country, that I would do him justice, as the sole inventor of this wonderful machine. The form and contrivance which I desired to delineate upon a paper, as in figure here annexed, I told him, although it were a custom of our learned in Europe to steal inventions from each other, who thereby at least this advantage, that it became a controversy, which was the right owner, yet I would take such caution, that he should have took the honour entire without a rival. We next went to the School of Language, where three professors sate in consultation, much approving that their own country. The first project was to shorten discourse by cutting polysyllables into one, and leaving out verbs and participles, because in reality all things are imaginal but are nouns. The other project was a scheme for entirely abolishing all words whatsoever, and this was urged as a great advantage in point of health as well as brevity. For it is plain that every word we speak is in some degree a diminution of our lungs in coercion, and consequently contributes of the shortening of our lives. And expedient was therefore offered that since the words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men to carry about them such things as they were necessary, to express the particular business that they were to discourse on, and this invention would certainly have taken place to the great ease as well as health of the subject, if the women, in conjunction with the vulgar and illiterate, had not been threatened to raise a rebellion, unless they might be allowed the liberty to speak with their tongue, after a manner of their own ancestors. Such constant, inconcealable enemies to science are the common people. However, many of the most learned and wise adhere to the new scheme of expressing themselves by things, which hath only this convenience attending it, that if a man's business be very great, of all various kinds, he must be obliged, in proportions, to carry a greater bundle of things upon his back, unless he can afford one or two strong servants to attend him. I often beheld two of these sages almost sinking under the weight of their backpacks, like paddlers among us, who when they met in the streets would lay down on their loads, open their sacks, and hold conversation for an hour together, then put up their implements, help each other to resume their burthens, and take their leave. But for short conversations a man may carry implements in his pockets and under his arms, enough to supply him and his house. He cannot be at loss. Therefore the room where the company meet who practise this art is full of things ready at hand, requisite to furnish matter for all this kind of artificial converse. Another great advantage proposed by this invention was that it would serve as a universal language, and be understood in all civilized nations, whose goods and utensils are generally the same kind, or resembling, so that their uses might be easy to comprehend. And thus ambassadors would be qualified to treat with foreign princes or ministers of state, whose tongues were utter strangers. I was at the mathematical school, where the teacher taught his pupils after the method of scarce imaginable to us in Europe. The proposition and demonstrations were fairly written on a thin wafer, in ink composed of cephalic tincture. This the student was to swallow upon a fastening stomach, and for 3 days eat nothing but bread and water. After the wafer digested, the tincture mounted to his brain, bearing the proposition along with it. But the success hath not hitherto been answerable, partly because some error in the quantum or composition, and partly by the perverseness of lads, to whom his bolus is so nauseous that they generally steal aside, and discharge it upon upwards before it can operate. Neither have they been yet persuaded to use for long abstinence as their prescription requires.